and arguing that there's room for further reconceptualization of sovereignty. It's vital to separate the concept from particular conceptions of sovereignty. What I'd like to give consideration to is the often overlooked political dimension of the concept of sovereignty. My argument is that conventional discussions of sovereignty focus on abstract parameters, legal and political sovereignty, internal and external sovereignty, in such a way that the political dimension gets lost. And just to be clear, this political dimension of the concept is different from the political half of the legal political distinction. It's about the relationship between sovereignty and politics, and has, I think, two aspects. Firstly, we ask sovereignty to stabilise how politics is conducted in any particular specific polity, and to provisionally fix the boundaries and limits of politics. But secondly, this is a political act that sovereignty achieves for us. We ask sovereignty to be neutral and above the fray of politics, above particular ideological positions and interests, but at the same time, its function is deeply political and provisional. In this way, sovereignty is successful when it's depoliticized and naturalized, but it's also open to the possibility of revision, based on an emergent imperative that its meaning is not natural after all. Sovereignty occupies a neutral position outside of politics and would be invalidated if thought to be partial or to be captured by particular interests. Yet it's also deeply political in regulating the negotiation of the norms and processes of political life in a particular society, through a claim that is conditionally stable. Sovereignty functions as the principle beyond which there is no appeal to a more ultimate set of rules, and yet that depoliticizing boundary is only conditional, unstable and tentative, and can be contested and reformed. To unpack this idea a little, we go back to the differentiation between legal and political sovereignty, which is one of the central dichotomies through which sovereignty is discussed in the mainstream discourse. Legal or de jure sovereignty is said to correlate to the idea of authority, is based on the right to command, and resides in the supreme law-making body, while political or de facto sovereignty corresponds to the idea of power, rests on the power to ensure compliance, and identifies the holder of political authority and capacity to govern. However, this distinction is only a very narrow one, since both sides of it concern what we can call ruler sovereignty in the context of a Rechtsstaat, understood as a modern state based on law as a moral principle. The term ruler sovereignty sums up the two sides of the traditional legal and political sovereignty instead of affecting a meaningful difference, since it's about the identification of the ultimate authority to make law, subject to no higher authority, and coincides with the conventional idea of internal sovereignty in terms of the competence and capacity, authority and power to govern. The key point is that the ruler sovereignty invested in the legal and political sovereignty formula leaves the political dimension of sovereignty unaccounted for. It's also clear that the political dimension of sovereignty described here is a feature of both legal and political sovereignty and of the field of politics overlooked by that dichotomy, and so is a condition of the concept rather than a new conception of sovereignty. Alongside the orthodox meanings focused on a narrow view of politics as ruling and governing, sovereignty is also a practice and a concept which operates within a broader understanding of politics, establishing the sphere and condition of politics, providing the conditional settlement of the content, parameters and limits for the conduct of politics within a political community, the provisional boundary between the political and unpolitical, the legitimacy or otherwise of challenges within politics, and so the identity of the political unit. At the same time, that settlement establishes a situation which is conditional, and these functions are politically negotiable. The mainstream notion of sovereignty focuses on the creation of order through law and rule-making within a modern state in the Rechtsstaat tradition, while this political dimension of sovereignty is about how the negotiation of a space for politics, the job we give politics to negotiate indeterminacy, which cannot be taken for granted, is organised in the circumstances of a particular political society. It's the repository of the political values that underlie traditional legal and political sovereignty, about the nature, scope and limits of politics, about what constitute legitimate questions and answers, which are expressed in laws, rules and policy orientations, as well as in social values and norms. Definitions of sovereignty which highlight supreme authority only point to the extreme case, and so can only be partial understandings. On a day-to-day basis, sovereignty is much more importantly this repository of political values. The view that sovereignty is constituted by a legal face in laws and a political face in the system of party politics and government leaves out of the equation the crucial glue provided by background, social norms and values, which in a sense express the constituent power of the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to confine my comments just to 4 points in response to Wendy's talk. The first one is around this question of the building of walls and at the same time as the erosion of sovereignty. And to ask the question of what those walls are around or what that sovereignty is over, Wendy labelled that in part the question of jurisdiction over space. Because, of course, one of the ways to answer those questions, both those questions, is territory. There are other ways, of course. But if we take territory as the object, and it's surely at least part of the object of what those walls are around and what that sovereignty is over, it seems to me that that raises some more general questions about what's been happening in the post-Cold War world, and something that I think has been increased but not caused by September 11th, 2001. Now, what I'm trying to get at here is the question of territorial integrity. This is a term that comes up in the UN Charter, that's common in UN Security Council resolutions. It was something that Tony Blair regularly made reference to in his foreign policy speeches. Now, territorial integrity in international law means at least two things. One of them is the question of territorial preservation, the fixity of boundaries around territories. But the other one is territorial sovereignty, that within those boundaries the state is sovereign, that it has exclusive internal sovereignty and equal external sovereignty. Now, these may be myths, these may be part of the sort of sovereign fiction behind the United Nations, but they're important in terms of the construction of an international system that was attempted after the Second World War. It seems to me that what's been happening over the past 20 years or so has been a pulling apart of these, a fracturing of the notion of territorial integrity, in that you have an increased stress on the idea of territorial preservation at the same time as a fully contingent sovereignty within those boundaries. This, I think, was anticipated by calls in humanitarian intervention over the treatment of civilian populations, but the very logic of that was taken up by the neoconservatives in making sovereignty contingent for at least two other reasons. One is the harbouring of terrorists within the boundaries of a nation state. The other one is the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. These, it seems to me, share a very similar logic, that you don't want to change the boundaries of nation states, but you do want to have the potential for an intervention from the outside within those nation states. And even in those cases where intervention has happened, in Afghanistan, in Iraq and so on, a lot of the attention since the invasion, since the regime change, has been to preserve that very territorial settlement that has been challenged by the erosion of the sovereignty within those borders. So I think that what Wendy's getting at is actually symptomatic of a much wider change that's been going on in challenges to the international system over the past 20 years or so. And I think that mirrors quite nicely the way that she's talking about the bounding of these states through the walling of the states at the same time as the sovereignty within them is kind of fizzling out or disappearing. The second point is around the invocation of the idea of Westphalia, the Westphalian system and the post-Westphalian system. And I take Wendy's cautions about this not being a complete superseding of the Westphalian system, but a kind of a movement beyond in some respects.